Hello and welcome to the YULLAX podcast. My name is Ron and this is episode 10, double digits of the YULLAX podcast. I gotta tell you, I have to come clean and give you a bit of insight here. Here's what happened. I tried yesterday of doing this podcast. I tried like 6, 7, 8 times. I deleted. Yeah, it wasn't good. but but sometimes you sleep on it and you find something else. So I decided to do what I did yesterday in a condensed version, and then tell you about something quite important. It's a reveal. It's a major reveal that I will do after this first segment. So the first segment is basically a recap of 2024. I go through the 9 podcasts, or I want to, and give you the highlights of each of them. The reason being that you might have skipped 1, 2, 3, or 9 podcasts in the past, and based on the title, well, that decision was made based on the title and the description that you saw. So I'm going to try to give you a little more description so that you can make a more educated decision. And maybe in there you'll find 1 or 2 or 3 podcasts that, well, you know what? I think I want to listen to that one or see that one. So let's go right into it. I'm starting with podcast number 1, which was published on February 29th. And there's a reason for that, which I reveal in the podcast. I dedicate the podcast to my mom. I tell you why I want to do this podcast in both languages, English and French. I talk to you briefly about me, why I want to do this, why now on that date, why the name YULLAX. All of that is explained in the first podcast, which is pretty short. It's 17 minutes. So if you want to invest that time and find out a little more of the reasons why I'm doing this, well, it's there. If not, it's fine. It's okay. You will survive. And so will I. Podcast number 2. It was published April 30th, and the title of that podcast is Dodgers versus Expos NLCS 1981. Well, obviously, it's about the baseball series, but there's a little more to it. First of all, I start the podcast with apologizing to my mother because I dedicate the first podcast to her and I never mention her name. How stupid of me. So I make that correction and also take the opportunity to give a little anecdote about her name because my mom was Italian. And anyways, you kind of watch the podcast to find out more. But it's about baseball. So this is my second podcast and I dedicate that one to my father because he's a great baseball lover. The guy, I've never met somebody that loves baseball more than my dad. So I don't only talk about the series opposing the Expos and the LA Dodgers, but also the fact that my father had a baseball dream and he had a broken dream and he moved from Quebec to Montreal. Then I talk about the Royals and Jackie Robinson and the Expos and the divisions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff all related to baseball. So if you don't care about baseball, you don't care about that podcast. But if you have some kind of baseball likings or interests, it should be a good podcast for you. I end the podcast talking about Rink Monday, Tommy Lasorda, the ranking that he has as a manager in the wins section. So there's a bit of data or statistics about baseball that you might find interesting. Podcast number 3. Well, I went off topic for the first time, which is not a big surprise. And I taped this podcast entitled Acoustic Cover of Smile. Where's my... it's in French here, sorry. Smile, the song from Charlie Chaplin. I'll get to that briefly. So I'm in Cleveland, downtown Cleveland, in a hotel, and I made the podcast from there, and I explain why. But I talk about the fact that I'm there in Cleveland, and the hotel I'm in is right next to the baseball stadium that I didn't know. Anyways, you have to listen to have more details, but it's kind of weird. And I talk about why I'm there, and I end the podcast. It's just not a very long podcast. It's 13 minutes. So it's not a big loss if you waste 13 minutes. And I end the podcast by doing an acoustic cover of the song Smile. Smile was composed by Charlie Chaplin. And I failed in the initial podcast to mention the lyricist of that song, which were John Turner and Jeffrey Parsons. So Charlie composed the music, and it's part of I think it's Modern Times, the movie. And later, the lyrics came by these two guys, and it became a very good song. I love it, and I do my interpretation. No pretension here, no ego or anything. I'm not saying I'm good, but I like. Anyways, you can listen to it. It's there. Podcast number 3, entitled. I just did that. Podcast number 4. I'm sorry. Podcast number 4, 1993 Stanley Cup. Well, that says it all, right? Wrong. First of all, this is a very important podcast to me because that's when I had my first and only guest on the podcast, my nephew Kevin, who was more than a guest. It was more of a co-host. And what happened, it was kind of magical because we didn't rehearse. We didn't, I invited him to the podcast. He had suggested that topic. And of course, it's about the series and hockey and this and that. But I mean, it's unrehearsed, non-scripted, and there's a good interaction. I mean, we're of different generations, of course. And I lived the 1993 Stanley Cup different than he did because he was just a boy. And I do mention in there some of my memories as growing up in the 70s and the run in the 70s that they won 4 straight Stanley Cup. And I was right there and I went to the 4 parades and all. So I mentioned a lot of that. The fact that Henri and Maurice Richard, they won 5 Stanley Cups together. That's another. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there other than just the 1993 series against the LA Kings. Well, that in itself is amazing because, number one, that's the first time that the LA Kings were in the finals. They have won the Stanley Cup since then, but that was their first presence in the final. And it's a lot because of Wayne Gretzky that was traded from the Oilers to NA. So there's a lot of that I mentioned in that podcast. So if you're a hockey fan, you can waste 30 minutes of your life and look it up. It's pretty good. Number 5, podcast number 5, published July 31st. I qualified this as the most significant podcast in my 9 podcasts here. It's about the Eagles, the band, but that particular topic is one of the major reasons why I wanted to do my own podcast. I did or I covered that same podcast or topic at somebody else's podcast. So I mentioned that. I was on Jeff Fillion's Radio Pirate podcast, and I talked about the Eagles with Jeff, and I tell you why. And I was kind of frustrated, not because of Jeff or anything. I mean, that's not my podcast. He had a limited time for me, and there's things that I wanted to say that I didn't get to say. So I said, well, maybe I should do my own podcast. So that's covered in that podcast. And I take it from Glenn Fry's death in 2016. Because what happened before is very well covered in the documentary History of the Eagles, which I mentioned in the podcast. So you should look that one up. And then I take it from there, and the fact that they kind of regrouped a few months later for the Grammys. Then Don went to do a solo tour, which I was lucky enough to see at the end of 2016. There was the Kennedy Senti Honors when they were honored there. So there's a lot of stuff in there. And from there, in 2000, mind you, it was through 2016, the band is done, over, we're done. And then suddenly, 2017, they reappear with Deacon Fry, the son of Glenn, and Vince Gill, and they went on tour. And they've been on tour ever since. So I cover all those tours, mention all those tours up to now, the residency in Las Vegas at the Sphere. They've been there since September. When I published this particular podcast, they were announced until January, but it's been extended since then, and they're going to be there at least until April of 2025. So there's time for you if you're going to be in Vegas and you want to check it out. It's a good show, I'm sure. There's a lot of clips on YouTube you can look at and see that, I really want to see this live, and I think you will want to. And I also talk about that controversy, if you will, about Don Henley having a tape lip syncing. Well, I have my theory on that. I don't believe it for 1 minute, so I'll explain that in my podcast, so you can check that one out. Episode number 5. So, episode number 6. Okay. Well, that one is kind of special because for the second time, I'm not in my studio. I'm in a hotel room in Detroit. And I share a slice of life. I had a shitty day. It was a shitty hotel. There's a lot of shit. And then I wasn't smart enough to tape this on landscape on my phone. It's on portrait mode. It's visually, it's no good. So you don't need to watch that podcast, but you might want to listen to it because there's a very interesting story in there. The title of the podcast is Rivets, Cats, and Camilla. Well, rivets because I sell rivets for a living. And in those functions, I came across this cat lover, which is the base of that particular podcast. And it's an unbelievable story. I tell you, you won't be disappointed. I swear. You can invest the 22 minutes into that podcast and you won't be disappointed, I don't think, because it's a great, unbelievable topic. As for Camilla, I just put that name into the title of my podcast, kind of a clickbait, because she's irrelevant to the podcast and irrelevant altogether, but that's not for me to say. I'm just saying that now we're in December, so she's irrelevant as of a few weeks ago. Anyways, you might want to check that one out. 7th podcast. That one is cool for me. I don't know that it is cool for you, but I was hoping and wanting to do a podcast at one point from both YUL, the Yule Airport here, or LAX in Los Angeles. And it happened for me in LAX. So the title of that podcast is YULLAX from LAX. So it says what it has to say. The setting is unbelievable. It's so nice. The background is nice. Where I found this spot to do the podcast without being disturbing or disturbed. And anyways, I found a good spot, and visually it's good. It looks like I'm an anchor for a credible news station, not doing a stupid podcast. So visually it's great. As for the content, well, if you have no intention in going to LA, or you never visited, so you won't relate. But I give some strategies here that I use, because when you get to LA and you need to Uber a ride somewhere, well, you want to avoid the crowd and you want to avoid the surge price. So I tell you how to do that. There's a few more things in there. I talk about my surprise visit to my daughter, and I start the podcast with mentioning that I was in Las Vegas just a few days ago, and I rant about how we report the heat waves now and only mention the feels like temperature as if it was the real temperature. I mean, if you don't want to hear a guy bitching, you don't want to watch that podcast, because I was pretty upset. All right. Podcast number 8, published October 31st. That should be a date in itself. If you want to see Ron in a wig, that's the one. But honestly, this is 36 minutes. It's my favorite podcast that I've done, because I went through something that I never expected. I was hoping to have a good night at the Troubadours. I did, but it was more than expected, because I made a human connection with somebody that I didn't expect to meet. My new friend Ed, a 91-year-old humble multimillionaire. That's how I can describe him. And I go through, it starts from my bus ride to there, through crossing the streets and being more respected by a self-driven car, by a human car. Anyway, it's my best podcast in my opinion. So that one gets my 5 stars. So if there's only, I'm going to give you one, well, that's the one you should watch. $18 minutes. All right. Lastly, but not the least, the podcast number 9, published November 30th. It's called Pink Floyd, The Wall. What can this be about? Obviously, it's about the band and the album, The Wall. But there's a little more to it. First of all, I published it 45 years later. Later. On the 45th anniversary, because they released The Wall on that date in 1979. I was alive. I was part of that thing. So I describe all of that. But I start with the Hocktua incident, because Roger Waters spat in the face of a teenager in Montreal in 1977, I think. Their date is correct in the podcast. I can't remember it now, but I'm pretty sure it's it. And that's what sparked the idea, and this and that. Everything starts with that Hocktua. Way before the Hocktua girl, by the way. But it's a spitting incident that triggered the history of music. And so, yeah, I talk about the recording sessions in LA, the the end of the Pink Floyd band with Roger Waters, the fact that they fired Rick Wright, the keyboardist, during the sessions. I mean, there's a lot of meat, if you will, to that particular podcast. So if you're a Pink Floyd fan, or if you really like that album, well, it's a good podcast for you, which concludes the 9 podcasts that I made under the YULLAX podcast umbrella in 2024. Okay. Excuse me. I need a little assistance. To talk about what I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I told you I would make some kind of a revelation or reveal at the end of the podcast. So we're there now. I have to put this in context, and strangely, it was triggered by myself watching lately Friends episodes. We have a station here in Canada, anyways, during the holidays that runs Friends 24/7. And I've been watching a lot of those episodes because Friends is very dear to me as a TV series, because that was a series that my kids grew up with. We would watch this together. That was a family moment every Thursday on NBC, I think. I hope. I don't know anymore. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was NBC. Whatever. It doesn't matter, but it was my moment, our weekly moment together watching Friends. And now I look at this and I see Chandler Bing, Matthew Perry, and he died way before me. I'm 62, he died at 54, which is very young. And I watch at the show now, and I feel a bit different because I know that Matthew is no longer with us. But at the same time, I don't know Matthew. I never met Matthew. I met Chandler Bing, and he's still there. He's still around. He's still part of my life, if you will. So I'm saying, oh, that's cool for these people to have something for their loved ones to look at and remember and cherish. And me, well, I was never on a TV show or in a movie. I never recorded a song or anything. I never invented something. So I have no legacy. There's nothing of me that people will remember. Well, the YULLAX podcast, this is my legacy. I'm building my legacy as I'm exiting this world. I'm 62 now, so I could be doing this for 5, 10, 15 years. Doesn't matter. But this can or could be viewed by my family and friends or anybody that wants to know me a little better once I'm gone. Because when you're alive, nobody cares. And suddenly when you're gone, oh. Anyways, I know my family cares, don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that the single fact that I'm doing this on a monthly basis, well, you can see me age from 1 month to the other, right? And when you look from 1 month to the other, there's no big difference. But once I do it for 10 years, you might watch the first one and 10 years later, and I will have aged, obviously, more. And so that will be available for people to see. So I have to be more selective of the topics I cover on this podcast. So far, there's no bullshit. I only talked about things that I want to, things that I care about. Yeah, sometimes last minute. Well, Cleveland is not something that I care about, but I still had something there. And so through those podcasts, I don't have grandchildren yet, and I might never have any. But if I do, they might want to know a little more about Grandpa. My nephews, one of them has one kid, and they're waiting for the second one. So these kids, no, if I die in 5 years, they won't know me live, but they might know me through this podcast. So this wasn't intended to be, but it kind of happened that, you know what? This is my legacy. So I commit to creating my future podcasts with that in mind. So I will never talk about something that I don't care about. And I will, if whatever I talk about, it will be my honest perspective on that particular topic or whatever. So once I'm gone, well, my people will find out what I was really about. Kind of tense, isn't it? Anyways, guys, it's 11:06, December 31st. So there's 54 minutes left to the year. I raise my glass. Wish you a very healthy and happy 2025. I'll hopefully be there for the whole year. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not sick or anything, by the way. It's not, but, along the way, if I find out something and it's life-threatening, I will share that with you. I commit to that. This has been a pleasure being here for 2024. Looking forward to 2025. And I will see you, well, you will see me next time on January 31st when I will tell you a little more. All right. I will tell you a little more where I want to go with the podcast. I have some ideas based on what I just revealed as my legacy. So cheers and see you in a month. Take care. I should take a sip, right? This will be R-rated because of my drinking the wine. Big deal. Ciao for now.